In this nugget, we'll take a look at how we can use DHCP policy to assign specific IPv4 options and configurations to a client. Let's begin. It was in the early 80s when I first started learning how to use a computer and how to do basic programming, and I still remember the logic of an if-then statement. If this condition exists, then do that. And with our DHCP services, we can also have if-then statements or logic that happens based on conditions. For example, we could say if a client has a certain fully qualified domain name, or if a client is coming in through a specific relay agent, or if the client has a specific MAC address, or if a client is associated with a specific vendor class or a user class. Then go ahead and treat them a little bit differently with DHCP. Maybe give them an extra option or a different option compared to what's already in the scope, or perhaps give them a specific range within the scope of addresses that you want them to use. And the policies that we can set up on our DHCP server, they can be at the server level, for example, for all of IPv4, or we can do them at the individual scope level. So let's start here on client 2-nug. In the upper right-hand corner, you have the name, and also on the screen of this computer, I've got this bitmap, reminding us of exactly where we are. All right, so here on client 2, let's go ahead and launch the integrated scripting environment by using the icon on the taskbar. Then I'd also like to take a look at the network connections by right-clicking on the Windows icon in the bottom left-hand corner, and then from the menu, select Network Connections. So some of the commands we're going to be issuing are things like ipconfig and ipconfig/release and ipconfig/renew. So let's see what we have to start with. So we'll highlight row number 1 and hit F8 with an ipconfig, and we have an IP address of 10.0.0.125. And I just want to verify, get a nice warm fuzzy that the communication is working between this client up on the 10 network and the DHCP server, DC-nug, down on the 192.168.1 network. And just to verify that things are working, I'm going to do a complete release of the IP address, give it a few moments, and then highlight row number 3 and do an ipconfig/renew. With that highlighted, we'll press F8. And I just want to verify that everything is working honky-dory. Now that took probably 15 seconds, which is quite a bit of time. And if you want to know the details about why you're taking so long, we could put on a packet capture and take a look at who dropped the ball or who had to re-request. But in any event, we have an IP address. It seems to be working. That's great. So now that we know that we have basic connectivity and the DHCP is working with the DHCP relay that we configured earlier in this course, let's go over to DC-nug directly and let's configure a DHCP policy for this client. Actually, before we leave, let's do an ipconfig/all. And we'll execute that by highlighting it and hitting F8. I just want to look at the MAC address because we're going to need that. All right, for the MAC address for this client is 0002B30000C2. We could also see that up in DHCP Manager. And let's make a road trip from client 2, and let's go and log on directly to DC-nug, who's acting as our DHCP server. Here on DC-nug, let's go ahead and launch Server Manager. There's an icon in the taskbar for that. And from Server Manager, we'll go to Tools. And from the drop-down, we'll select DHCP. And we'll expand that full screen. So here's our super scope and our multicast scope, and our scope for the 10 network and the scope for 192.168. And let's apply the policy, not at the server level, but let's do it at the individual scope level. So let's expand the 10.0.0 scope, which is where our current client 2, is getting an IP address from. And just to confirm, we can click on Address Leases for that pool, and there he is. So as we look at this scope, we have a policies option for this specific scope. This policies option down here is for the server. And what we want to do is we want to do a policy just for the 10.0.0 scope. So with that policy selected, we'll right-click, and from the menu, select New Policy. And let's name it our space DHCP policy, and click on Next to continue. Next, it's asking us about the conditions, the if part of the if-then statement for DHCP policies. So to add a condition, we'd simply click on Add, and then we have a drop-down. We can do it based on the user or vendor class, the MAC address, the client identifier, fully qualified domain name, or the relay agent information. For our demonstration, because I know what the MAC address is for client 2, we just looked at it, let's go ahead and use MAC address as the condition. For the operator, it can be equals or not equals. And then we'll put in the value of that MAC address, which is 0002B30000C2. And we'll click on Add. And then we'll click on OK. Now, if there were multiple conditions that we were looking for, we could go ahead and click on Add again. And then we could put another condition in. And as we add new conditions, we can specify we're looking for this condition and, for example, another condition, or we could use the or option to look for either condition. So the bottom line is it can be very flexible in what we're looking for as far as looking for a match. So in our example, we're going to look for just the MAC address that ends in C2, shown right there, and we'll click on Next. And now it's specifying that because this is a policy for a scope, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can carve out a set of addresses from the existing scope that will be used for clients that match the policy. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and use 10.0.0. And let's use 141 as the beginning mini range, if you will, within this scope for clients that match this policy. And the ending range will be 10.0.0.145. That'll give us 5 addresses, although we're only going to have one client that has that MAC address. However, the benefit of doing this from a learning perspective is that when we do an IP config and we see that the client has an IP address within the range of 141 through 145, we'll know why. It is because it matched this policy. So we'll click on Next to continue. And now it's asking us, would you like to set up any special options regarding the clients that match this policy? So they're going to inherit everything from the server and the scope, just like normal. However, if we want to set specific options here, we can add some here as well. I'm just going to have us inherit whatever we currently have at the server and scope level. So we won't add anything new here. We'll simply click on Next. And then we'll click on Finish to finish the wizard. So here's our policy. And if we look at the scope options just above that, I just want to confirm what the options are for the scope that the clients that match this policy, which are also in this scope, are going to inherit. So our client will still get a default gateway of 10.0.0.102 and a DNS server and a DNS domain name. Fantastic. So our last step is to verify that the policy is working. So let's go back to our client 2-nug machine. Here at client 2, let me go ahead and bring back up the network connections and also the PowerShell scripting environment. And let's do an IP config just for grins, just to verify what our current address is. We haven't yet done a renewal. So it's 10.0.0.125. So then what we'll do is we'll highlight row number 2, hit F8. We'll release that. Then we'll highlight row number 3, and we'll do an IP config /renew. And we'll give that a few seconds to cook. And in the lab, if you are interested in the individual details for those packets, you can go to dc-nug, just fire up Wireshark, listen on Ethernet 0, and then take a look at the packet capture. And as we have before, you can do a display filter looking for just boot P to see the DHCP only related information. And check it out. Now, even though that did take about 15 seconds to do it, it came back with the IP address 10.0.0.141. And as it's the only client up there, the only reason it would jump to 141 with no other clients contending for IP addresses in that pool is because of the policy. And so now, my friend, it is your turn. I would encourage you to launch the hands-on lab, practice setting up a DHCP policy and verifying that it works. And when you're done, I'll see you in the next nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.